When the company brought in the new boss, I had a feeling things might change, but I didn't expect things to get complicated this quickly. My wife and I worked for the same company, a decent-sized firm where everyone generally kept to themselves, and work was just that, work. Then, out of nowhere, they brought in this new guy as our boss. Apparently, my wife knew him from before. She mentioned that they'd gotten along well in the past, and now, if things went smoothly, it could make our lives easier. It didn't sit well with me from the start, but I kept my thoughts to myself. The last thing I wanted was to cause unnecessary tension at home over something that could turn out to be nothing. Soon enough, I noticed changes. The boss started keeping my wife late after hours. Not just once or twice, it became a regular thing. She'd come home later and later, and each time, she seemed to have some explanation for it. Just wrapping up, or he needed some extra help with a report. It wasn't the staying late that bothered me as much as the pattern. I couldn't ignore it. So one evening, I decided to confront her. I asked why it was always her that had to stay late. Why not anyone else? Why did this guy seem to rely on her so much more than he did anyone else in the office? She didn't get defensive, which I appreciated. She just said that maybe it had something to do with her getting a promotion soon. She explained that they were discussing possibilities, and her staying late might be a good sign. It meant she was being considered. She sounded genuinely excited about it, and I'll admit, I wanted to believe her. If it was true, a promotion would be good for us. Extra money, maybe less stress down the line. Still, something about it didn't feel right. I didn't say anything more at the time, just nodded and let her have her excitement. Days passed, and it kept happening. He'd keep her late, sometimes well past dinner time. I cooked for myself, ate alone, and watched the clock tick. She always had the same story, something about work, something about making an impression. I could tell she thought this was her shot at moving up in the company, and for a while, I tried to support her, even if my gut kept telling me otherwise. It didn't make sense to me why a new boss, who barely knew the team, would single her out this much. But I didn't want to come off as the jealous type, so I held back. Then, just like she said, the promotion came. One day, she walked through the door with this grin on her face, holding a bottle of wine she must have picked up on the way home. She told me they'd promoted her, better title, better pay, more opportunities. She looked genuinely happy, and I could see how much it meant to her. She said it was all thanks to the new boss giving her a chance to prove herself. I nodded, congratulated her, and we celebrated that night, just the two of us at the kitchen table. But deep down, I still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't about the promotion, I wanted her to succeed. It was about the way it happened, the circumstances around it. There was no denying that her boss had taken a special interest in her, and I wasn't sure why. She tried to reassure me, saying that everything was professional, that she was just putting in the work to get ahead. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was overthinking it. But part of me wondered if I was seeing the full picture. I decided not to push it any further, not right then. I didn't want to ruin what should have been a good moment for her. As the days went on, I tried to bury my doubts. She started coming home at regular hours again, and things almost went back to normal, at least on the surface. But every time she mentioned her boss, I felt that knot in my stomach tighten. I watched her closely, not because I didn't trust her, but because I didn't trust him. Something about the way she spoke of him, about how he saw potential in her, it rubbed me the wrong way. Still, I kept my mouth shut. I figured I'd give it time and see if things settled down. After the promotion, my wife suggested we invite her boss and his wife over for a barbecue. She insisted it would be a good idea, a way to build connections and keep things smooth at work. I wasn't exactly thrilled about having this guy in my backyard, but I agreed. If this was important to her, I'd go along with it. Besides, maybe I'd get a better read on him in a more casual setting. We set a date for the weekend, and I spent most of that Saturday prepping the grill and getting everything ready. I wasn't about to half-ass this. If we were doing it, we were doing it right. The day of the barbecue, they showed up right on time. Her boss, Greg was all smiles, acting like we were old friends, which I found a bit strange considering we barely knew each other. His wife, though, caught my attention immediately. She looked tired, not just a little worn out, but genuinely exhausted. Her smile seemed forced, and her eyes had that hollow look like she'd rather be anywhere else. I couldn't help but notice it. As we all sat down in the backyard, I made small talk, trying to get a feel for her. But Greg seemed to answer every question for her, cutting her off before she could say much of anything. She just nodded along, like she was used to it. At one point, while my wife and Greg were off talking about work, I took the opportunity to ask his wife if everything was all right. She gave me a quick smile, barely lifting her eyes, and before she could say a word, Greg was right there, jumping in with an answer. He said she'd just been feeling a bit under the weather lately, nothing serious. She nodded, not saying anything, just looking down at her plate. It was odd, the way he controlled the conversation, the way she seemed to fade into the background. I didn't push it any further, but it stuck with me. Something about the way she looked and acted just didn't sit right. The rest of the barbecue went off without any major issues. We ate, drank, and made small talk. My wife seemed to enjoy herself, laughing and chatting with Greg like they were old friends. I played along, but my attention kept drifting back to his wife. She hardly spoke, and when she did, it was only when Greg wasn't around. She seemed nervous, like she was walking on eggshells. It wasn't my place to pry, but I couldn't help but wonder what was really going on there. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it. Later that night, after everyone had left and we were cleaning up, I brought it up to my wife. I told her what I'd noticed, how Greg's wife seemed off, how she barely spoke unless he was out of earshot. My wife just shrugged it off, saying that maybe she was just tired. She reminded me that Greg's wife had mentioned not feeling well, and maybe that was all there was to it. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. It wasn't just tiredness, it was something deeper, something that made me uneasy. My wife told me not to worry about it, that it wasn't our business, and maybe she was right. But the image of Greg's wife, sitting there with that empty look in her eyes, stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the way Greg controlled every aspect of their conversation, the way his wife seemed to shrink in his presence, it all felt off. I decided to let it go for the moment, but I made a mental note to keep an eye on things. Over the next few days, I tried to put it out of my mind, but it kept creeping back in. I couldn't help but replay the barbecue in my head, the way Greg's wife barely spoke, the way she seemed to disappear into herself whenever he was around. My wife seemed content to move on, but I wasn't so sure. I wasn't about to start accusing anyone of anything without proof, but I knew I'd be watching more closely from now on. Maybe my wife was right, and it was nothing more than exhaustion or a rough patch. But I'd seen enough to know that sometimes, things aren't always what they seem. I wasn't going to ignore my gut just because it was easier that way. If there was something going on, I'd find out eventually. For now, I'd keep my eyes open and wait for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. A while after the barbecue, I started noticing something different. My wife was bringing home a lot more money. It wasn't just a small raise, it was significant. I didn't ask about it at first, thinking maybe it was just part of her recent promotion. But as the weeks went on, it became clear that this was more than just a regular pay bump. One evening, as we were having dinner, she casually mentioned that she'd been promoted again. This time, it wasn't just a title change, it came with a hefty salary increase. She seemed proud, and I could see why. But something about it felt off to me, like it was happening too fast. She didn't stop there. She told me to be ready because she was working on something else involving me. That caught me by surprise. I wasn't expecting anything to change in my career, and I wasn't sure what she meant. She said she'd been talking to her boss about opportunities for me as well, that they were almost finalized. I nodded, but it made me uneasy. I wasn't sure how I felt about my career being discussed without me, especially with someone like Greg. I didn't want to seem ungrateful, but I couldn't help but feel like I was being pushed into something I hadn't asked for. It wasn't long before her colleagues started reaching out to me. Some sent messages, others even called. They were congratulating me, saying how great it was that things were moving forward for both of us. They spoke as if it was all a done deal, as if they knew more about what was happening in my life than I did. It made me uncomfortable. I wasn't used to being in the spotlight like this, and I definitely wasn't used to people assuming I was on board with something I hadn't even agreed to yet. I thanked them, tried to be polite, but inside, I felt like I was losing control of the situation. My wife, on the other hand, seemed thrilled. She talked about how everything was finally coming together for us, how this was the break we'd been waiting for. She spoke about Greg as if he was some kind of savior, the guy who was making all our dreams come true. I tried to share in her excitement, but it wasn't easy. I didn't trust Greg, and I wasn't sure I wanted anything from him. The more she talked about him, the more I felt like he was trying to insert himself into our lives in a way that made me uneasy. It was one thing for my wife to get a promotion, but it was another for him to be pulling strings for me without my consent. One night, after another congratulatory call from one of her coworkers, I decided to bring it up. I asked my wife why everyone seemed so certain about my future when I hadn't even been told the details. She brushed it off, saying that it was all part of the plan, that she wanted to surprise me. She said that Greg had connections and that he was willing to help me get ahead, just like he had helped her. I didn't like the sound of it. I told her I wasn't comfortable with surprises when it came to my career. I wanted to know exactly what was going on before any decisions were made. She looked a little hurt, like she didn't understand why I wasn't more grateful. She said she was just trying to help, that this was a good thing for us. I didn't want to argue, so I let it drop. But inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were moving too fast, that I was being pulled along without a say. I appreciated that she wanted the best for us, but I needed to feel like I had some control over my own life. I wasn't about to let someone like Greg decide my future for me, no matter how much he had supposedly done for my wife. The next few days were tense. My wife kept talking about the opportunities coming our way, about how we needed to be ready for the changes. I tried to stay supportive, but it was hard. Every time she mentioned Greg, I felt that knot in my stomach tighten. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was manipulating things, that he had his own agenda. My wife seemed blind to it, caught up in the excitement of her promotions and the money coming in. I didn't want to burst her bubble, but I couldn't ignore my instincts. As more messages and calls came in from her coworkers, I started to feel like I was being backed into a corner. Everyone seemed to know what was happening except for me. They all talked as if this was the natural next step, as if it was only right that I should be getting a boost thanks to Greg's influence. But I didn't want to owe anything to Greg. I didn't trust the guy, and I wasn't comfortable with the idea of him having any say over my career. I knew I had to find a way to take back control, to make sure that whatever happened next was on my terms, not his. The time came for another get-together, this time at Greg's place. My wife was excited, as always, eager to keep up the connection. I wasn't particularly looking forward to it, but I knew it was important to her, so I went along with it. We arrived at their house, and I immediately noticed that Greg's wife, Karen, looked even more worn out than the last time I saw her. She was polite, smiled when she needed to, but there was something in her eyes, a sadness that seemed to run deep. It wasn't just tiredness, it was something more, and it bothered me. As the evening went on, we all made small talk, the usual pleasantries that come with these kinds of gatherings. Greg was his usual charming self, always in control of the conversation, always the one steering things where he wanted them to go. My wife seemed perfectly at ease, laughing at his jokes, engaging in discussions about work and future plans. I tried to play along, but my attention kept drifting to Karen. She barely spoke, and when she did, her voice was soft, almost hesitant, like she was afraid of saying the wrong thing. At one point, my wife excused herself to go to the bathroom, leaving me alone with Greg and Karen. Greg got up to grab something from the kitchen, and I saw my chance. I leaned in a bit closer to Karen and asked her if everything was all right. I kept my voice low, not wanting to draw attention. She looked at me for a moment, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, fear, maybe, or resignation. She shook her head slightly and whispered that this wasn't the place to talk about it. Before I could say anything else, Greg was back, and the moment was gone. Greg must have noticed that I'd been talking to Karen, because he came over and put a hand on my shoulder, guiding me away from her and towards the other side of the room. He smiled, but there was something in his eyes that felt more like a warning than anything else. He told me that Karen had been feeling under the weather lately, that there was nothing to worry about. He said it in that smooth, confident way of his, like he was used to people taking his word without question. I nodded, but I didn't believe him. There was more to it, I was sure of that, but I wasn't about to push it right then and there. After that, Greg shifted the conversation to me. He mentioned that there were opportunities coming up at work, something that might interest me. He said it in a way that made it clear he wasn't just making small talk. He looked me in the eye and said that soon I'd have a chance to receive an offer that would be hard to refuse. I didn't like the way he said it, like he already knew what my answer would be. I forced a smile and told him I'd think about it, but inside, I felt a mix of anger and unease. I didn't like being cornered, and I definitely didn't like the idea of Greg trying to pull me into whatever he had planned. The rest of the evening went by in a blur. My wife came back, and the conversation shifted back to lighter topics, work, upcoming projects, plans for the future. I tried to stay engaged, but my mind kept drifting back to Karen and what she'd said, or rather, what she hadn't said. There was something going on, something that Greg was keeping under wraps, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it was only a matter of time before it all came to the surface. My wife seemed oblivious, caught up in the excitement of the evening, and I didn't want to spoil it for her, so I kept my thoughts to myself. As we left Greg's house that night, my wife was all smiles, talking about how well the evening had gone and how great it was that Greg was looking out for me. I nodded along, not wanting to dampen her mood, but inside, I felt a growing sense of unease. Greg wasn't just looking out for me, he was trying to control the situation, trying to pull me into something I didn't fully understand. And Karen, there was something wrong there, something that Greg was hiding. I knew I couldn't ignore it, not if I wanted to protect myself and my wife from whatever was coming. Over the next few days, I kept replaying the evening in my head. The way Karen looked at me, the way Greg stepped in before she could say too much, the way he talked about the opportunity coming my way, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle I couldn't quite put together. I knew I needed to be careful, to keep my eyes open and not let myself get pulled in without understanding what was really going on. Greg was playing a game, and I wasn't about to let myself be a pawn in it. Not long after the evening at Greg's house, I noticed something else that caught my attention. One evening, while I was using our shared computer, I stumbled upon some strange search queries in the browser history. They were related to large bedroom toys, the kind of thing that definitely wasn't part of our usual conversations. It struck me as odd, and I couldn't just let it go without saying something. It wasn't the kind of thing I could ignore. So later that night, I decided to bring it up with my wife. I asked her about it directly. I didn't accuse her of anything, didn't raise my voice, I just wanted to know what was going on. She looked at me for a moment, then laughed, like it was no big deal. She said it was just a joke between her and one of her friends. Apparently, her friend had been joking around, and they'd looked it up together. She said her friend was in an open relationship and had been talking about all sorts of things, and it had come up as part of their conversation. She made it sound like it was just harmless curiosity, nothing more. I took her at her word. She seemed calm, and I didn't see any reason to doubt her. She explained that her friend was just messing around and that they were having a light-hearted conversation. It didn't seem like anything worth making a fuss over. I told her that I wasn't particularly interested in those kinds of topics, but if it was just a joke, then fine. She nodded and reassured me that it was nothing serious. I let it go at that, not wanting to blow things out of proportion. She also mentioned that her friend had asked her opinion on open relationships, and they got to talking about different things. I made my stance clear, I wasn't interested in that kind of lifestyle, and I believed that marriage was meant for two people, nothing more. She understood and didn't argue. She said it was simply an interesting discussion and nothing more than that. She seemed genuinely fine with my response, and we moved on from the topic without any tension. From that point on, I decided not to dwell on it. My wife had given me an explanation, and it made sense. People have all kinds of conversations, and sometimes they look things up just out of curiosity. There was no point in reading too much into it. We had a good marriage, and I trusted her. I wasn't going to let something small turn into an issue when there wasn't any real reason for it. The next few days went on as usual. My wife acted like everything was normal, like our conversation hadn't been anything significant. She went about her routine, smiling, talking about work, making plans for the weekend. I did the same. Life was busy, and we had enough on our plates without me worrying about something that was already settled. If she said it was just a joke, I believed her. There was no need to make things more complicated than they needed to be. I knew that the best way forward was to keep focusing on what mattered, our life together, our plans, and our future. There was no point in letting small doubts creep in where they didn't belong. We had worked hard to build a good life, and I wasn't going to let anything disrupt that. My wife had always been straightforward with me, and I had no reason to think otherwise now. The next evening, after dinner, my wife approached me with an idea. She suggested that we should spice things up and have some fun. At first, I wasn't quite sure what she meant, but then she mentioned inviting Greg over. That threw me off. I couldn't understand why she'd want to bring her boss into something that should have been just between us. I asked her what she meant, and she started to explain, her tone casual, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Not long after, Greg arrived. He walked in like he owned the place, all smiles and charm, but there was something unsettling about it. My wife seemed relaxed, almost excited, which only added to my confusion. Then they both sat down, and Greg began to speak. He mentioned the opportunities at work again, the ones he had hinted at before. But this time, he didn't stop there. He started talking about fantasies, about ways we could all benefit if I was willing to participate. It took me a moment to realize what he was implying, but once it clicked, I felt a surge of anger. Greg and my wife were suggesting that I become a part of their sexual fantasies, offering me a good position at work and a significant salary increase in return. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wife, the person I trusted more than anyone, was sitting there, nodding along as if this was a perfectly reasonable proposition. The more Greg talked, the angrier I became. He spoke like he was doing me a favor, like I should be grateful for the opportunity. It was sickening. I stood up, my hands clenched into fists. I couldn't listen to another word of it. I demanded that they both leave. I told Greg that he had no right to come into my home and make such disgusting suggestions. I looked at my wife, and I could see the shock on her face. Maybe she hadn't expected me to react this way. But I didn't care. This was beyond anything I could tolerate, and I wasn't about to let it continue for another second. Greg tried to calm me down, saying that I was overreacting, that we should all just sit down and talk it through. But I wasn't interested in talking. I wanted him out of my house, and I made that very clear. I wasn't about to let someone like him manipulate me or my wife. I didn't care what kind of opportunities he was offering. No job, no amount of money, was worth compromising my dignity. I told him to leave, and I meant it. My wife tried to say something, to explain or justify what was happening, but I cut her off. There was nothing she could say that would make this okay. The fact that she had even entertained the idea was enough to make me question everything. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and furious all at once. I wasn't going to stand there and listen to excuses. I wanted them both gone, and I wasn't going to ask again. Greg finally got the message. He stood up, still trying to maintain that smug smile, but I could see the tension in his eyes. He said something about reconsidering, about how this could be a missed opportunity, but I didn't care. I watched as he walked out the door, my wife following behind him, still trying to say something to me. I didn't want to hear it. I closed the door behind them, locking it, and stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. That night, I sat alone in the living room, my mind racing. I couldn't believe how far things had gone, how twisted everything had become. The betrayal cut deep, but more than that, I felt a sense of resolve. I wasn't going to let anyone, not Greg, not even my wife, dictate my life or push me into something I didn't want. I knew that from this point on, things were going to change. There was no going back to the way things were before, and I was ready to face whatever came next. After Greg and my wife left, I was done with the confusion and guessing games. I knew what had happened, my wife had betrayed me, and Greg was behind all of it. There was nothing left to figure out. I wasn't interested in understanding Greg's twisted motives or my wife's excuses. I wanted one thing, to make sure Karen, Greg's wife, knew exactly what kind of man she was married to. I picked up my phone and called Karen. She answered after a few rings, her voice hesitant. I wasted no time getting to the point. I told her what had just happened, that Greg had come into my home and tried to pull me into some sick game, offering me a promotion in exchange for becoming part of their twisted fantasies. I made it clear that my wife had been in on it, that this wasn't just a misunderstanding. There was a long silence on the other end before she finally spoke. Karen's voice was shaky, but she didn't sound surprised. She admitted that she already knew about Greg's behavior. She said she had known for a long time what kind of man he was. She told me that she was in a similar situation herself, that Greg had been forcing her into things she didn't want to do for years. She said that he cheated on her regularly and that he was abusive, both physically and emotionally. She stayed because she felt she had no choice, he controlled the money, the house, everything. Hearing her say that made my anger burn even hotter. I wasn't just angry for myself anymore, I was angry for her too. Greg was a monster, and he had been getting away with it for far too long. I told her that she didn't deserve any of this, that no one did. She sounded defeated, like she had accepted her fate, but I wasn't about to let that slide. I told her that she needed to get out, that she couldn't keep living like this. She hesitated, then said that it wasn't that simple. Greg had too much control, too many connections. If she tried to leave, he would ruin her. I could hear the fear in her voice, and I understood it. But I wasn't going to let Greg win. I told her that I was willing to help, that she didn't have to do this alone. She thanked me, but I could tell she wasn't convinced. She had been living in fear for so long that she couldn't see a way out. It was frustrating, but I knew I couldn't push her too hard. She had to make the decision for herself, and all I could do was offer my support. Before we ended the call, Karen told me that she was sorry for what had happened, that she wished she could have warned me sooner. I told her it wasn't her fault. The blame lay squarely on Greg and my wife. I thanked her for being honest with me, and I promised her that if she ever needed anything, I would be there to help. She sounded grateful, but I could still hear the resignation in her voice. It was clear that she didn't believe things could change. After I hung up, I sat there for a while, my anger still simmering. Greg had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let it go. He had not only destroyed my marriage, but he had also been abusing his own wife for years. I knew I had to do something, not just for myself, but for Karen as well. I wasn't interested in playing detective or trying to piece together the truth anymore. I had all the information I needed. Greg was a manipulative, abusive bastard, and it was time someone stood up to him. After my conversation with Karen, I knew it was time to take action. Words were no longer enough, and I wasn't going to sit around waiting for Greg to make his next move. I needed evidence, something concrete that could show exactly what kind of man he was. I decided to get a recording device and a camera. If Greg thought he could walk all over people without consequences, he was in for a rude awakening. I wasn't going to let him get away with it, not anymore. I went to an electronics store the next day and bought a small recording device and a discreet camera. I wanted something that could capture everything without being noticed. I wasn't sure what my next encounter with Greg would look like, but I knew I needed to be prepared. I wasn't going to let myself be caught off guard again. I wanted proof, something undeniable, that I could use to expose him, both to the authorities and to anyone else who needed to know the truth. When I got home, I took my time setting everything up. The camera was small enough to hide in the closet, positioned so that it would have a clear view of the living room. It was the perfect spot, out of sight, but able to capture everything that happened. I tested it a few times to make sure it worked, adjusting the angle until I was satisfied. I needed this to be done right. There couldn't be any mistakes. Next, I hid the recording device. It was tiny, easy to conceal. I decided to tape it under the table in the living room, where any conversation would be clearly picked up. I tested it as well, speaking at different volumes to make sure it would catch every word. The quality was good, and I felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that I was ready. If Greg or my wife tried anything again, I'd have the evidence I needed to prove what they were up to. But I wasn't naive. I knew that things could still go wrong. Greg was unpredictable, and there was no telling how he might react if he realized what I was doing. I needed to be ready for anything, including the possibility that things could get violent. So I took one more precaution. I took a kitchen knife and taped it to the bottom of one of the chairs in the living room. It wasn't something I wanted to use, but if it came down to it, I wasn't going to let myself be a victim. I had to be ready for whatever might happen. Once everything was set, I took a step back and looked around the living room. It looked the same as always, nothing out of place, nothing to give away what I had done. I felt a sense of calm that I hadn't felt in days. For the first time since this whole mess started, I felt like I had some control. I wasn't just reacting anymore, I was taking action. I was ready for whatever came next, and I wasn't going to back down. That night, I went over everything in my head, making sure I hadn't missed anything. I knew there was no guarantee that Greg would come back, or that my wife would try to pull something again. But if they did, I'd be ready. I wasn't going to let them catch me off guard, not this time. I was done being the one who was always a step behind, always trying to figure out what was happening. Now, I was the one setting the trap. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let Greg or anyone else take advantage of me again. I had the camera, the recorder, and the knife. I was ready for whatever came next, and I wasn't afraid. If they wanted to test me, they'd find out soon enough that I wasn't the kind of man who backed down. Not anymore. I knew it was time to put my plan into action. I picked up the phone and called my wife, telling her that I was ready. There was a moment of silence before she agreed, saying that she and Greg would be over soon. I hung up and took a deep breath. I had everything set up: the camera, the recorder, and even the knife under the chair. I wasn't going to back down, and I wasn't going to let them walk all over me. This was it. It was time to get the evidence I needed. It wasn't long before I heard the knock at the door. I opened it to see my wife standing there, Greg right behind her, looking as smug as ever. They walked in, and Greg wasted no time getting to the point. He asked if I had finally come around, if I was ready to take the offer he'd made. I looked him in the eye and asked him what exactly I would get in return for my agreement. He smiled, that same arrogant smile, and repeated his proposal: a higher position at work, more money, and all the benefits that came with it. All I had to do was go along with what they wanted. I nodded, pretending to consider it. I could see the satisfaction on Greg's face, like he thought he had won. I agreed, telling them that I was willing to do what they wanted. My wife looked relieved, and she disappeared into the other room for a moment. When she came back, she was holding an oversized toy, the kind that I had seen in those strange search queries. I kept my expression neutral, watching as she handed it to Greg. They both looked at me, waiting for a reaction, but I stayed calm. I needed them to think I was on board with this. Greg and my wife wasted no time. They started right there in front of me, acting like I was just a bystander, like my presence didn't matter. I clenched my jaw, my eyes fixed on them, but I stayed still. I needed to wait, to let the camera and recorder capture everything. I needed enough evidence to make sure there was no denying what they were doing. The anger inside me was building, but I kept it in check. I couldn't afford to lose control, not yet. As the minutes passed, I could feel my patience wearing thin. They were so caught up in themselves that they didn't even notice me watching. They thought they had me beaten, that I was just going to sit there and let them humiliate me. But they were wrong. I had waited long enough. I stood up, and they barely even noticed. I walked over to where Greg had put the toy, my hand shaking with anger. I grabbed it, and without warning, I swung it at him. The first hit caught Greg completely off guard. He stumbled, a look of shock on his face. My wife screamed, but I didn't stop. I kept swinging, the anger that I had held back for so long finally unleashed. Greg tried to defend himself, but he was too stunned to react. I wasn't going to let him get away with this, not after everything he had done, not after everything he had tried to take from me. I wanted him to understand that I wasn't someone he could control, that I wasn't going to be his pawn. My wife tried to pull me back, screaming at me to stop, but I barely heard her. All I could see was Greg, the man who had tried to ruin my life, who had manipulated my wife, who had treated us both like we were nothing. I didn't stop until I saw the fear in his eyes, until I knew that he understood that this was over. I threw the toy to the side, my breathing heavy, and looked down at him. He was on the floor, gasping, his arrogance completely gone. I stepped back, my wife still screaming, tears streaming down her face. I didn't care. I had done what I needed to do. I had taken back control. I looked at Greg one last time and told him to get out of my house. He struggled to his feet, stumbling towards the door. My wife followed him, still crying, but I didn't stop them. I watched as they left, slamming the door behind them. The room was quiet now, and I felt a sense of finality. It was over. They thought they could break me, but they were wrong. I wasn't broken, not by a long shot. After Greg and my wife left the house, I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle in. The anger was still there, but it had cooled into a steady resolve. There was no going back now, and I didn't want to. My marriage was over, and it was time to make that clear. I walked through the house, gathering all of my wife's belongings, her clothes, her personal items, anything that belonged to her. I wasn't going to let any trace of her stay in my home. I grabbed some trash bags and started packing her things, not caring about keeping them neat or organized. As I worked, I thought about everything that had led to this moment, the lies, the betrayal, the humiliation. She had made her choice, and now I was making mine. Once I had everything packed up, I took the bags out to the curb and left them there. I went back inside, locked the door, and took a deep breath. It felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. When my wife eventually tried to come back, she found her things on the curb and the locks changed. She pounded on the door, shouting, demanding that I let her in, but I ignored her. I told her through the closed door that I was done, that I wanted a divorce. There was nothing left to discuss. She tried to argue, tried to plead, but I wasn't interested in hearing it. I had made up my mind, and there was no changing it. She had betrayed me in the worst way possible, and there was no forgiveness for that. After she finally left, I turned my attention to the evidence I had gathered. The camera and the recorder had captured everything that had happened, every disgusting detail of Greg's proposition and their actions. I knew what I had to do. I took the footage and brought it to the police. I explained everything, Greg's manipulation, his abuse of power, the way he had tried to use his position to coerce me and my wife. The officers listened, and I could see the seriousness in their faces as they watched the footage. There was no denying what Greg had done. It didn't take long for the consequences to come down. Greg was fired from his position, his career in ruins. My wife, too, was let go. She had been complicit in everything, and there was no way she could stay at the company after what had happened. I felt a sense of grim satisfaction knowing that they were finally facing the consequences of their actions. They had thought they could do whatever they wanted without repercussions, but they had been wrong. They had underestimated me, and now they were paying the price. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking about Karen, Greg's wife. She had been through so much, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. I decided to reach out to her, to see if there was anything I could do to help. When I called her, she sounded surprised, but also relieved. We met for coffee, and she opened up to me about everything she had endured. It was heartbreaking to hear, but I was glad she finally had someone she could talk to, someone who understood. I made it clear to Karen that she didn't have to go through this alone anymore. I offered to help her in any way I could, whether it was finding a place to stay, getting legal advice, or just being there to listen. She had been isolated for so long, and I wanted her to know that she had support now. As we talked, I could see a glimmer of hope in her eyes, a hint of strength that had been buried under years of fear and control. It felt good to be able to do something positive after everything that had happened. Over time, Karen and I grew closer. It wasn't romantic, not yet, at least, but there was a genuine connection between us. We had both been hurt by the same man, both been betrayed by people we should have been able to trust. We understood each other's pain in a way that no one else could. Helping her gave me a sense of purpose, a way to move forward from the wreckage of my marriage. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. It had been a while since I had last seen either Greg or my wife, and I had hoped that it would stay that way. But one evening, there was a loud, insistent knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I looked out the window, I saw them, Greg and my wife, standing on my porch, both of them looking angry. My heart began to race, and I knew that this wasn't going to be a peaceful conversation. They had come looking for trouble, and I wasn't about to let them intimidate me in my own home. I grabbed the gun I had bought for protection, something I had hoped I would never need to use, and approached the door. I opened it just enough to see them, but kept the gun hidden behind my back. Greg started yelling immediately, demanding to know why I had gone to the police, why I had tried to ruin his life. My wife stood beside him, her arms crossed, looking just as furious. They both thought they could come here and bully me into backing down, but they were wrong. I stepped back and told them both to leave. I made it clear that I wasn't interested in hearing anything they had to say, and that if they didn't leave, there would be consequences. Greg's face turned red with anger, and he stepped forward, shoving the door open. He yelled that he wasn't going anywhere until he got what he wanted, that I was going to pay for what I had done. I could see the rage in his eyes, and I knew that things were about to escalate. Without hesitation, I pulled out the gun and pointed it at him. I told him to back off, that this was his last warning. My wife gasped, her eyes wide with fear, but Greg wasn't backing down. He lunged at me, his hands reaching for the gun, his face twisted in anger. In that split second, I knew I had no choice. I pulled the trigger, and the gun went off. The sound was deafening, and Greg stumbled backward, clutching his leg as he fell to the ground. My wife screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. Blood was seeping through his pants, and he was writhing in pain, cursing at me. I kept the gun pointed at them, my hand shaking, but I didn't lower it. I told my wife to call an ambulance, and she fumbled for her phone, her hands trembling. I could hear her sobbing as she spoke to the operator, but I kept my focus on Greg. He had tried to attack me in my own home, and I wasn't going to let my guard down until the police arrived. It didn't take long for the sirens to echo down the street. The police arrived, their lights flashing, and I put the gun down, raising my hands to show that I wasn't a threat. They rushed in, quickly assessing the situation. One officer handcuffed Greg, while another spoke to me, asking what had happened. I explained everything, how Greg had forced his way into my home, how he had attacked me, and how I had fired in self-defense. My wife was still crying, but she didn't deny what had happened. They took Greg away in an ambulance, and I was taken down to the station for questioning. I told them everything, and they listened carefully. I was honest about what had happened, and after reviewing the evidence, they decided that I had acted in self-defense. It was a relief, but the whole ordeal had left me shaken. Greg had tried to control me, to intimidate me, but in the end, he had only hurt himself. He was charged with breaking and entering an assault, and they locked him up. In the days that followed, I tried to come to terms with everything that had happened. It wasn't easy, but I knew that I had done what I had to do. Greg and my wife had made their choices, and they had paid the price for them. I wasn't proud of what I had done, but I knew that it had been necessary. I had protected myself, and I had stood my ground. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of closure. The nightmare that Greg had brought into my life was finally over, and I was ready to move on. Time passed after the incident with Greg, and life slowly began to settle into a new normal. I focused on rebuilding, on putting the pieces of my life back together after everything that had happened. I hadn't heard from my wife since that night, and I was grateful for the silence. I needed time to heal, to move forward without the constant reminders of betrayal. But one day, out of the blue, there she was, standing at my doorstep, her eyes filled with tears. She looked different, more vulnerable, more desperate. She asked if we could talk, and I could see that she had been crying even before she arrived. I didn't want to let her in, didn't want to hear what she had to say, but there was a part of me that needed closure. So I stepped aside and let her in, closing the door behind her. She stood there, wringing her hands, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for something familiar. She started talking, her voice trembling. She apologized for everything, for betraying me, for lying, for letting Greg manipulate her. She said that she had made a terrible mistake, that she regretted everything she had done, and that she wanted to come back. She begged me to give her another chance, to forget everything that had happened and start over. She promised that things would be different, that she would never hurt me again. Her words were full of desperation, and I could see that she meant them. But it was too late. I listened to her, letting her say everything she needed to say. I could see the pain in her eyes, the regret, the fear of losing everything. But as I stood there, I realized that I felt nothing for her anymore. The love that had once been there had been shattered by her betrayal, and there was no putting it back together. I told her that. I told her that what she had done was unforgivable, that there was no going back. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. She started crying, begging me to reconsider. She said that she couldn't imagine her life without me, that she had realized how much she loved me and how wrong she had been. But her words fell flat. I had heard enough lies, enough promises that meant nothing. I wasn't about to let myself be pulled back into the mess that she had created. I had moved on, and I wasn't going to let her drag me back into the past. I told her that it was over, that I had no interest in trying to fix something that was beyond repair. She looked at me, her eyes wide with disbelief, as if she couldn't understand how I could be so cold. But it wasn't about being cold, it was about protecting myself, about making sure I never went through that kind of pain again. I had given her everything, and she had thrown it away. There was no coming back from that. She stood there for a moment, as if hoping I might change my mind. But I didn't. I turned away from her, making it clear that the conversation was over. She sobbed, pleading one last time, but I didn't respond. Eventually, she left, her footsteps echoing down the hallway as she walked away. I closed the door behind her, locking it, and felt a sense of finality. It was truly over, and I was ready to move on. In the days that followed, I felt a strange sense of peace. My wife had tried to come back, but I had stood my ground. I had chosen myself, my own well-being, over the toxic relationship that she had tried to resurrect. It wasn't easy, but it was the right thing to do. I knew that I deserved better, and I wasn't going to settle for anything less. The past was behind me, and I was ready to embrace whatever the future had in store.